So, without further ado, I want to bring on Mystic Mark, and let's bring him onto the stage. Hey, Mark, how you doing?
Good. What's up, Rye? Nice to meet you. Nice to be here on the Lost Frequency podcast. Sorry,
All
Tom couldn't be here. That was all my fault. I was late, but that's okay.
it
Hopefully, Tom joins us, or maybe another time.
perhaps he might even be able to call in from his location. If he sets his computer up, he should be able to call in as well, or he might turn around and come back. We'll see. He doesn't live too far away.
Cool.
So, Mark, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and where they can find you? Promote anything you want.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. My podcast is called the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, and I talk about all sorts of strange stuff with strange people, all the things I'm interested in, and uh, yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Fantastic.
As far as what I research, I've been researching a ton of stuff about America and trying to understand the history that's been forgotten.
Mm.
This whole old world conversation really got me interested in finding like what's really going on. And yeah, I've come to some pretty cool uh, lengths to find information. Going to different sources, going on the ground and researching places in person, whether it's in the middle of the woods somewhere or in the middle of a city. There's tons of strange stuff in America to be discovered and to be learned about.
That is awesome. Yeah, that sounds a lot like we had Sean Hibbler on here a couple weeks ago, and he's telling us about his new documentary that he's going through for Tartaria, and it definitely sounds like finding the lost, forgotten, or hidden history is something that I find fascinating. It's you never really think about it until you actually so someone brings it up to you and say, like this doesn't add up, or this doesn't add up, or why are we doing this? It's kind of like the horse before the cart, or the cart before the horse. Sorry. When we're describing certain things, we have these huge buildings, just amazing architecture, and then we're dealing with mud roads, and it's really interesting. I find it absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, the more research I've done, the less I've found anything to do with Tartaria.
Mm,
Not
interesting.
to, not to, you know, go on a tangent here, but yeah, what I'm
No, yeah,
researching.
let's go on that tangent. Tell us what you found. I'm all ears, and I'm always open to listening to to every aspect, every side of the story.
Yeah, so as far as history goes, there's a established history, and then there's what's been left out of that, right? And
Yep.
lately, a lot of people on YouTube they go and or even social media, they'll show you photographs of old buildings and say, "Oh, this can't be built when they say they built it. This must have been built, sometime, in the ancient past or when
Hmm.
technology was different, or so on and so forth." And you know, I don't know about you, but a lot of that stuff to me goes a little too far
Some of
in
it does. I
sensational.
do agree with you. There's sometimes where I'm just like, that's a far stretch. It's kind of stretching it a little further.
And I think what's going on is there's, a new wave of propaganda, we'll call it, that
Okay.
is trying to cover up something real. What's real behind that propaganda? Because otherwise, it wouldn't need to create some fake story if there wasn't something to hide. So I'm starting to wonder if the growing evidence for Atlantis
Yep.
um, made some people, interested in this Tartaria theory for maybe the wrong reasons. I don't know. I'm not really explaining this well, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it seems like Tartaria has co opted a lot of the Atlantis theories that used to be more
Mhm.
prevalent in the counterculture type of conspiracy world. So that being said, I'm not a fan, nor am I an enemy of the Tartaria thing. I think there's
Yeah.
definitely some truth to it as far as Asia goes, but I'm very skeptical about, Tartaria in North and South America. If anything, it seems to me like the indigenous people that were here had a more advanced culture than they've been given credit, or they had a, lost connection to the rest of the world that has now either been written out of history or forgotten, right? And, there's
Yeah.
tons of evidence for that. One culture that's pretty well documented as having been here before Columbus is the Vikings, right? And I live in New England, so this a little bit closer to home for me. There's a Newport Tower. A little further to the west, of course, there's Kensington Runestone, and uh, allegedly the Vikings and other northern European cultures were here before Columbus and probably sailed down the Mississippi or throughout the Great Lakes. And things like iron forges have been found in certain areas that suggest whatever cultures were here certainly used metal.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of the accounts from conquistadors and pilgrims and settlers during the Age of Discovery is that Native Americans did not have metal implements. They had gold, but they didn't have like iron. They hadn't really worked with metallurgy to that degree.
Yeah.
Now, if you consider the fact that they've found iron mounds, basically mounds that have iron like forges inside of them that are ruined now, but very long ago they were used to smelt iron. That goes against the narrative altogether that there wasn't an advanced culture here in the Americas. So there's this picture starting to build. And again, I'm not a totally opposed to the
Hmm.
whole Tartaria thing. I prefer to call it old world because I think that's a more accurate term. But I do
More
think
fitting.
that there are old world cultures that have been written out. And I do think that there are old world cultures that probably had advanced technology that was eventually, replaced with more digital technology that we're familiar with now.
Yeah.
Analog technologies, a lot of the inventions that were created around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century are still utilized all over the world. I mean, you told me before we started recording that you're in Mexico. I wonder how many diesel engines there are in Mexico because a diesel engine is much more reliable and long lasting than a lot of the modern cars today. And in rural areas, people use diesel engines for many many decades. I wonder if that's going on over there. I've never left America, so I'm just kind of speculating on what goes
I
on.
will say that actually the diesel engine is not as popular down here.
Hmm.
It's harder to actually get diesel gas in well, at least in the areas that I have been. I've been in northern Mexico and southern Mexico and central Mexico, so I've been around a fair bit here, and diesel is not as common. Possibly just the refining process; it's just easier to make gas. But I know diesel is a byproduct of gas. But
Well,
yeah,
maybe people just don't know that you can burn other things inside of diesel engines, corn oil and other things like that. So, but yeah, these are the kind of inventions and technologies that have been taken away in favor of things that can be commercialized and mass produced, things that are quantifiable, things that have a
hmm
sort of, as the William Morgan quote goes, you gotta be able to put a meter on it, they're not just gonna give people free energy because then they can't, charge people monthly for it, right? So, that's
exactly.
kind of the idea that I think is really lying behind this whole old world shift. The way we create things has certainly changed, and I don't know if that's necessarily because, there's this whole society that's been written out and, all the history 200 years ago and beyond is just false. I don't go that far, but I
Yeah.
think that people have a good reason for thinking that way. Same thing with like flat Earth. Like we've been lied to so much. I'm not particularly a flat earther, but we've been lied to so much by NASA and all these groups that I don't blame people for believing in the flat earth. I think it's justified considering the amount of propaganda there is out there. It's a whole nother conversation on whether that's intentional or not. Like they're creating these conspiracy theories to alienate certain groups of people that are, more likely
Yeah,
to
like
believe in things like that.
oh yeah, like psyops on psyops, and just to totally to separate, like all the conspiracy theories. It's not just one group of people that believe in conspiracy theories. Like there's this group, there's that group, and oh, this group doesn't believe what that group does. And flat Earth, of course, is one of the biggest ones. That is probably one of the most alienating groups of all. It's tough to be a flat earther, and I said this when I was talking with Sean. I said, I'm not necessarily a flat earther, but I don't really subscribe to the globe model, at least the globe model that we're being presented with. Could the Earth be a lot bigger? Could the Earth be hollow? I don't know. But
Yeah, and I think we have to definitely consider there's a limit to our knowledge, and maybe something like accurately uh, measuring the circumference of the earth is not as easy as it might be in your imagination. Maybe it takes a lot more than modern science is willing to admit they're capable or not capable of, right? I wonder how much of hubris or that kind of personal or anthropomorphic sort of thing gets in the way of truth, where some
mhm,
truths are too big for humans to really know. So these government folks are like, well, let's not tell them that there's other continents that we've never been to because that's too scary. I mean,
yeah,
hey, yeah, the Earth could be way bigger, have more land, and they're only showing us a small picture of it with the satellites. I don't think that's totally implausible. Same line of thinking goes with Hollow Earth. Like you have these massive cave systems. How do we know
yeah,
there aren't civilizations of people living in caves or on some other side of the caves that has a different ecosystem than we're even familiar with? A lot of people lately have been saying maybe aliens come from that realm rather than coming from outer space. We've been kind of conditioned to believe that aliens come from above us when maybe they're, as some people think, uh, demons that kind of like float in and out of dimensions, or maybe
yeah,
not even demons. Maybe that's too much of a religious term. Maybe they're just more like entities that don't have a physical body, and they exist simultaneously in the same space as us but not in the same frequency. So the same way we
agreed.
could be looking at a rainbow and not see the 4 or 5, 6, 7 other colors that there are on it, we only see the Roy G. Biv that our eyes recognize. Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe there are aliens who are literally outside of our physical perception unless they choose to show themselves, and that's a big part of what people are starting to think with this whole alien conversation. Extraterrestrial seems to be replaced by ultra terrestrial, the same way UFO has been replaced by UAP, right? People are calling them UAPs because they don't necessarily always fit that flying saucer or flying object
Hmm.
category. Object meaning inherently a physical thing. What if these aren't physical, and that's why we're calling them aerial phenomena now, because it's more of a phenomena than it is a physical object. I mean,
Yes,
we're
true.
kind of dancing all over the map here, but I would love to hear your thoughts. Go ahead.
No, no, I totally agree. And one thing I look at is like words have a lot of power to them. So when we look at the word like extraterrestrial, you know, terrestrial means of the earth. It doesn't mean of anywhere else. And we're saying extra. Okay, so why are we saying extra of the earth? So if we're reading into that, that means they're coming from here. They're not coming from somewhere else. And when you're talking about other dimensions, I talk about this often. Where I like to compare it to like Russian nesting dolls. I believe we're stacked on top of each other, and whereas you can only see certain far. If you're one underneath, you can only see certain far. You can only see a certain distance, and we're all within the same realm per se, but we're just in different phases. I had a one of our one of our past guests, he was talking about how he was kind of phasing in and out as he was being abducted by these aliens. They literally passed him through the walls, and he said he could taste the wall, he could taste the plaster, he could taste the wood as he was passing through the wall. And so it's telling us that they moved him out of phase, and that's when he could see things differently. He could see them then. And so it's really interesting. And I totally believe that I don't doubt that possibly there is a possibility that there are beings that come from other outer space, but I believe there's a lot more from inner space, or from other dimensions within our space that we are here, the here and now. Like they could be walking among us and we just can't see, exactly like you said. They're just out of phase, they're out of frequency with us. And I totally agree with that too. It's fascinating. I find it really interesting, and it's like, where do we prove this? And I know there was just that video released recently where, and it can all be taken with a grain of salt because it was released by the military, leaked military footage where they had, like, it looked like a jellyfish and it was phasing in and out. Its colors were phasing in and out. And, could that be a possibility? I'm also in the camp that there is a possibility of a, like, organic, or like these crafts are organic, biological. I think
Yeah.
there's a possibility of that as well. I have so many questions, and every time I get it's more questions, one answer maybe, and 10 more questions pop up after that.
Yeah. Yeah, and if objects or beings, organic or not, in the sky can phase in and out of reality, what if whole cities can do that? Like we have this idea of a phantom timeline or phantom civilizations. What if, there were whole cities that exist in a higher frequency? You have like legends of Shambhala, or
Shambhala, yes.
yeah, these different, places where great mystics and ascended masters live. Could
Hmm.
be some truth to that. I wonder, you know, when it comes to like cryptids and whatnot, how much of it that is something that's like us disturbing the other realm instead of honoring it. So now we're
Hmm.
getting like these horrifying nightmare versions of what used to be like spirit guides and angels and things that help us. What if these beings they're more like reflections of our cultural inner world, where when we turn our backs to nature, nature turns its back on us. When we turn our back on
Hmm.
the earth creates these beings that, turn their back on us, so to speak, right? It could be
Interesting.
something along those lines. We live in this ecosystem, this symbiotic balance of all these different beings. Something like a virus in the population of deer could totally destroy the ecosystem here in North America. I don't think we necessarily think in those terms when it comes to the world around us, but we are just one part of a larger ecosystem, and maybe these alien beings and cryptids and things like that play a interdimensional role symbiotically that we're just not, kind of attuned to with our five senses on a normal basis.
And
People
so
like
what you're sorry, and so what
your
you're saying is that, because it's a symbiotic relationship, but we're kind of turning into parasitic, is that we're creating an imbalance through it, almost, in a way. Is that what you're saying? Not parasitic, but I'm saying like we're not treating things fairly, so we're causing like a reaction that should not be like a balanced reaction, maybe.
well, yeah, I mean, it's not even a matter of fairness, but it's more of a matter of like if to look at one microcosm rather than the whole macrocosm for a moment. Your body's immune system, when it has something going wrong, it corrects that problem on its own using different, chemical mitigatory actions, right? You'll have like different cells doing different things. The T cells come in and they eliminate the invader, so on and so forth. And I think the same thing happens on a macro scale with whole species, whole
Mhm.
biomes. the ecosystems and how they interact with each other through the seasons. And maybe in a dream-like mental mind sphere kind of realm, there are idea entities that battle us when our ideas have become, you know, not symbiotic, right? When they cease to flow with the whole, we sort of have these T cell ideas that come in and eliminate them. I mean, we're talking in terms of like super philosophical, abstract stuff here, but when you consider what people experience,
Yep.
borders on the realm of abstract, and you have to ask yourself like, we're clearly not in a physical dimension, so what kind of dimension are we in? You know, it's not we're not experiencing purely physical phenomena. You could choose to live in a world where you only perceive that, you ignore this
Yep.
outside, but you can't deny that humans have and always have experienced or do experience these otherworldly things, whether it's an encounter with a being that's unexplainable or a sense that leads them to understand information that is physically unknowable to them at that present moment in time, that causes them to act on something that maybe saves their life or the life of another being. I mean, these are extreme circumstances, but
Yeah.
it happens in mundane ways as well, where maybe you miss your train, and then you run into somebody who you went to high school with, and it's like this amazing reuniting moment. In one instance, you thought, "Oh, my day's screwed up because I just missed my train." In another instance, it was like, "No, you were meant to miss that train because you and this old friend needed to reunite." I think
Yeah.
that's kind of in a similar way how maybe things work on a huge collective level, where when we pollute the wilderness and we exploit the wilderness creates beings like werewolves or Bigfoot or whatever to scare us out of the wilderness so we could, respect it more, right? I mean, maybe
Hmm.
that's part of this whole thing. Or
So
or
the
with farming, right? You have all
Yeah.
these farmers that, I think farmers can be in balance with the land, but a lot of these like bigger operations are not in harmony with the land. And what happens to their cattle? They get mutilated sometimes, they get preyed on. Even in ancient times, people would have like, weird werewolf sightings, and a werewolf would kill their whole flock of sheep, and or a vampire or something like that, right? Maybe
Yeah.
that's what's going on here, where there's this larger biological correction mechanism that occurs on a more spiritual mental plane than an actual physical one.
That's extremely interesting, and I find that fascinating. Yeah, so these are like guardians. They become guardians of the forest and of these other areas.
Yeah.
Now, you had brought up like cities phasing out, and something I always talk about it on the show here is that I have these really fascinating in-depth dreams, and I believe dreams are so much more than just recollections of what just happened or just reviews of what just happened during the day. Don't get me wrong, sometimes that happens, but I've had so many dreams that are predictive, like they've told me what's going to happen a couple days in advance. Even one was 4 years in advance. It was 4 years to the day the exact dream happened, like word for word. So it was fascinating. But when you're talking about places phasing out, I had this dream of this one specific place that I went and visited, and it's on the specific drive. It was about a 6 hour. There's I used to go to these two locations. We'll say like there's like the summer vacation spot in Canada everybody would go to, um, between where I lived. And on the way there, in my dream, there was this town. And even when after this dream, when I was awake, I swear to God that this town was real. Like I swear on everything holy that this town existed. And I did this drive maybe a couple times a year, I knew the exact location where this turnoff should be, where this turnoff to this town should be. This town should be there, but it never existed. It never existed. But in my dream, and I almost believe that it's like another reality or another timeline that was just erased. Maybe I was bumped over to another one, or I had a glimpse of one, or I don't know, but I honest to God believe that this town existed in a different time different place, and
I
gone,
love
gone.
that I love that anecdote you just shared because it kind of brought a dream that I have a lot to mind. I'm from New England. You just said Canada, so I imagine you're familiar probably with like what my environment looks like. Canada is very similar to, you know, the northeast of America and like,
Yeah.
forest types and whatnot. But I personally have never been somewhere where there's redwood forests. You
Okay.
know what I'm talking about with the tall
Yep.
trees. And every now and then and throughout my life, maybe over the past 10 years specifically, every now and then I'll have a dream where I'm in this setting with like very kind of modern looking houses with like glass kind of walls and tall redwood trees. And I've never been in that environment before. So it's interesting that my mind takes me there. Obviously I've seen, movies and things with that setting, but uh I wonder sometimes after waking up from those dreams, like, yeah, that felt real. Like, what? I've never been there, but is that like a future place I'll go to? Um, I don't know. It's just like
Or it's a
it's a
place
very
existing in the same time, but
yeah.
it's a different you that's been there, and you're able to
Mm.
like don't get me started on dreams. I could talk for hours and hours
So
about dreams. Like, yeah.
on the point of vanishing cities, that there's this author named Jacques Vallée and other people like him have done similar research. Someone that I've spoken to, Joshua Cutchin. And a big point that they make is that the UFO phenomena has only been modern, has only reflected like modern views in the modern era. But there
Mhm.
were other sort of sightings that go along those lines. They just reflected what people were writing and thinking about. And one of these examples in the past, before maybe even like something like the cart with horses pulling it was a popular, mode of travel, people would see flying cities, like these cities in the distance, like floating in the clouds, and they would call them like, holy heavenly cities, things like that. And one vision in particular was like of this city in the sky, and I forget the guy, but he's someone who's mentioned in the Bible, and his prophecy and his vision of this city in the sky, like kind of informed in some ways the legends about the Temple of Solomon, I believe. Could be
Mhm.
mixing it up with a different holy site, but the Temple of Solomon is, like, the main one that comes to mind for me. Um, but either way, it's kinda weird weird because then, like, as technology changes, people see flying chariots, they see flying wheels, they'll see flying horses. As boats become more popular, they'll see flying ships, right? And ancient
Yeah.
people, I mean, canoes are an ancient invention, and ancient cultures have seen like flying boats and flying canoes and things like that for a long time as well. So it just kind of goes into this theory, and maybe you are right to say it's more organic than it is physical, because whatever these beings are, they can clearly like reflect what is in our minds, right? Because those people tended to see things that they were already familiar with in the sky. And now in this like sci-fi world where we have like chrome cars driving down the street, maybe that explains why you'll see like a chrome slick disc thing flying through the sky, or like a black dark triangle. It reflects what's in the consciousness of the witness rather than like conforming to its own standards.
It could be so what the witness themselves can digest or visually see, kind of thing. It's kind of,
Right.
I believe that it was back when the conquistadors, or even I don't know, when the large boats went to North America and South America. This was when the natives were there, and allegedly they said that they couldn't see them because they had never actually seen them before. So they couldn't perceive this. So maybe it was something that that we maybe could perceive, and so that's what they take shape as. They form into these things that perhaps we can accept, maybe they look into our minds and say, oh, okay, this is something that maybe we can pull out of there. And that kind of makes me think of a gentleman I was talking to. He was talking about a demon, that something beside his bed. And he said, it was there to scare him. And it looked like this demon from this video game that he had played. And, of course, some people are brushing it off. They're like, oh, that's just your mind playing tricks on you. And I'm like, no, 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 because he said his wife saw actually almost the identical thing at a different night. And so I was like, well, it could be that this entity is seeing what maybe creates fear, so it can, mold itself into that, to take that form so it can do that. So it's a very big possibility that these crafts are saying, okay, this is not to get fear, but to say, okay, this is what can be acceptable, like a wheel. And I've seen that wheel before, it's like a wagon wheel flying in the sky, or, a chariot. And it's like, okay, we're going to do these things because that is what, we're not going to completely blow your mind. We're going to blow your mind because it's flying in the air, but it's not, it's something maybe that you can describe. And I know that, there's been many paintings where they have UFOs in these paintings, and yeah, there's a chariot or something, or something that they themselves can digest.
Yeah. Yeah, and, going back to the idea about, you know, the Native Americans or the Native, South Americans, the indigenous
Hmm.
people that saw the conquistadors, I don't fully subscribe to that. I've heard that, and I've even
Yeah.
said that on my own podcast, but, like, as soon as you started saying that, I was like, "Oh, I know what he's gonna say," say," because 'cause I've thought about this a lot, and I'm like, I wonder how true that is. I wonder how, how likely it would be that they would understand what they were seeing. I don't
Yeah.
think they would understand what they were seeing because 'cause they'd probably never seen boats that massive, and they knew what boats were, right? They had canoes, so, like, to them, a boat was something that a person sat in. It wasn't like this huge house on the water with a giant sail and cannons and
Yeah.
gold and copper and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? Probably a very astounding sight, but I don't know necessarily, like, that they would have been unable to perceive it at all. I think they just would have been probably confused about what it actually was. But that brings to mind, like, something that I talk about, and you asked me, to get into the Atlantis subject. And the reason why I think that's more important to wrap our heads around as Americans than and South Americans as well, North Americans, not just people in the United States.
Yeah.
But I think we all need to sort of wrap our heads around this idea more than the Tartaria thing. If you live in Asia, if you live in Russia, go nuts. But I think the Tartaria thing is relegated to that realm. I think the larger conversation about the old world shows that the inhabitants of North and South America were probably connected to the cultures of Africa and Europe because they all were the diaspora of the Atlantis cataclysm. So what happened there? We have this landmass that was once in the Atlantic Ocean, hence the name Atlantic Ocean. Um, and there's tons of evidence in the Caribbean to show not only underwater structures, but also above ground structures, because what is now above water would have then been high ground. And
Yeah.
typically, cultures build sacred sites on high ground. You'll have a lot of, especially in Buddhist cultures, you'll have a lot of mountain monasteries, temples on top of mountains. So it's not strange that some of these islands would have evidence of this old culture. And I think part of this age of discovery was actually calculated. It wasn't that Columbus and all these folks were finding it for the first time. I think they knew exactly what they were getting into because they had understood that other Europeans had traveled to this part of the world before Columbus. That's why Columbus was able to find it. Not only did they know, but they had to keep it a secret. This was a big reason why Venice flourished when it did, because they kept this secret away from the other groups that were in Italy that would have had to come around the boot heel, I think, or
Yeah.
I think they actually had the disadvantage, but because they kept it a secret, they were able to sneak past the others, whatever other city Venice was competing with. Might be Florence, but I don't wanna get things wrong. People could go and look up Joseph Farrell's work on that for more information. But during that age of discovery, Columbus was backed by a certain Italian group that had foreknowledge of, uh, the New World, and I mean, it's not surprising now to think they would have had the information, because there were tons of Northern European and even the Portuguese sailors that were going across the Atlantic to this part of the world. So, in my mind, I wonder if this new Atlantis project that Francis Bacon writes about was not named that poetically. It was named that because they knew they were finding the remnants of Atlantis and they had to take it over because it was significant to the roots of their culture. I mean, you think about the Western civilization, it's a Greco-Roman creation. It's very much rooted in the Greco-Roman world and even more so in the Egyptian world as well, because those 2 worlds were very much informed by the Egyptian world and, Mesopotamian and so on. So,
Yeah.
we have these roots to the ancient world which recognized Atlantis. You have Solon and these different people telling Plato about Atlantis. And then you have this gap in time where, okay, now these people don't believe in this time at all. I don't think that the case. I think it just either wasn't written about or maybe not a popular idea, but it was definitely popular to the people who had an interest in, regaining those reigns of power, creating that great empire that Alexander tried to create. Napoleon took a whack at it. Others took a whack at it,
Yeah.
some unsafely that we won't mention.
Yeah.
And
Exactly. Exactly.
The British Empire is very much still actively doing that. I mean, they still control much of the land in the world. So, I think in America being kind of like their big, secret ally, I especially after the Revolutionary War, maybe not so until the War of 1812, but definitely after the War of 1812, you have this kind of pseudo alliance going on. And intellectually speaking, that alliance never was broken because you have Yale, Harvard, Cambridge, and Oxford, which are these just like cesspools of elites from the Ivy League schools in America. You
Yep.
have the think tanks that could, theoretically keep the old world idea under wraps. I think that's exactly what happened. They made the Native Americans into these noble savages, telling people that, "Oh, yeah, no, they were Stone Age, they were primitive, they didn't advance, for some reason, this whole 2 continents was stuck in this stasis where their
Yeah.
cultures only advanced so far." And I just don't buy that. I think it's more likely that they had very advanced technologies here that the European folks couldn't make sense of and destroyed because they couldn't make sense of it. Things like what we see in Egypt, things like, pyramid technology,
Yeah.
possibly, free energy technologies that are available to be understood today, but not many inventors are ever able to patent anything in that realm because, you end up getting sent into a tree at 100 miles an hour, and your car
Yep. Or
manufacturer.
yeah, or you're poisoned, or you're involved in a shooting, and yeah, a mass shooting.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
and so
it's crazy. There is a lot of pyramids down here in Mexico, and Teotihuacan, the three pyramids. It lines up exactly with the pyramids of Giza. It's there's some
well, and
similarities. It's like
not only do they line up with the pyramids at Giza, but they also line up with most of the major cities on the East Coast. If you draw a straight line down the East Coast, from Boston to Teotihuacan, New Haven, Connecticut, New York City, Trenton, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, um, New Orleans in Louisiana, and then Teotihuacan. Those are all on the same line, and I don't think that's an accident. It's a big part of my research into this whole Atlantis conversation. Back in the day, they called that line the axis of the axes of Satan, Satan's axes.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
basically, what that meant was everything west of that line was considered uncivilized. It was still the frontier, you know, you had people going out and trapping and hunting in those realms, but it was still mostly just Native Americans out there and the occasional French or Dutch trapper colony, right, or community.
Hmm.
So that was all developed land for that in that period of time. And yeah, they called it Satan's axes, which is kind of interesting. You know, the religious worldview of those people colored their world in many ways. But, you know, things like giant skeletons and mounds and these pyramids, and there's talk of pyramids even further north in Mexico in places like California, Arizona, Utah, Montana. I mean, there's people come by mountains every now and then that seem to be shaped like pyramids, and they're like, that's odd. So yeah, I think there's something going on with this cover up of the old world,
Yeah.
and free energy technology is probably part and parcel to it, which is why they can't let this information out. And maybe that also explains why America developed so quickly, because we were here, we had this industrial revolution, and you know, who knows, maybe there's some technology that was hinted at in some sort of uh, petroglyph down there in Mesoamerica or South America or the Southwest that showed something that they were able to figure out. I mean, we've seen things along those lines in Egypt, like the helicopter that's depicted on
Yep.
an Egyptian hieroglyph, or even the more talked about light bulbs that are kind of pictured in one of the temples. So we have instances of this in other cultures. Maybe it's possible this stuff's been erased here. One example of a petroglyph in New England that isn't really discussed often is the Dighton Rock in Massachusetts, and it seems to depict a man wearing a suit of armor carrying a broadsword, like a classic
Really?
claymore type of sword, you know, with the big hilt and the double edge, and you know, and obviously Native Americans weren't fighting each other in suits of armor, so you know that's at least the image we're given of them. We're told that they had feathered outfits and leathered skins and tan, you know, this kind of thing, and maybe they learned how to ride horses because of the Spanish. Maybe the horses were already here. There's some debate about that. I don't know. But you know, they seem to have took to riding horses pretty quickly, and maybe
Mm,
that's because there were horses here in the ancient past, and they're just genetically, you know, able to do that. For whatever reason, the horses, you know, didn't survive, but the people who could ride them did, right? So,
yeah.
because there was clearly a cataclysm in the Americas. I mean, I think it's called like Hell's Canyon or something like that, where they find tons of skeletons and different dinosaur species and things. So there's been a series of cataclysms here. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that the Atlanteans were necessarily uh, side by side with the dinosaurs, but some of the information that I found, and big shout out to an author named Michael Laflamme, who wrote a book called Visions of Atlantis. I'm going to be interviewing him soon on my podcast. But one of
I
the really
I
interesting
actually
things that
recall
he
you
does.
mentioning I recall you mentioning that book, and that was one thing actually I was trying to look for myself to grab a copy.
Yeah, it's great. It's available on Amazon. You can get the ebook version as well. But yeah, the book shows how not only is there tons of evidence for Atlantis in the form of megaliths and different stone ruins around the world, but we also have these weird accounts from people who were channeling in the 19th century, where they would channel these entities that were essentially claiming to be Atlanteans, and they would tell them things about Atlantean society. And one of the really strange things was how this kid, uh, who basically wrote a book called oh shoot, I think it's called Philos the Tibetan. That's the name of the author, but that's not
Okay.
his name. His name was something like Frederick Oliver, and his book was written by this entity that he channeled, and the entity was named Philos the Tibetan, and the book is called A Dweller on Two Planets. So they write this book together, him and this entity. And keep in mind, this is an 18-year-old kid in like the wild west of California, frontier of California in the late 1800s. So he's not like watching or even reading sci-fi anything. It didn't exist to people back then. This kind of pulp sci-fi fiction that we're really familiar with now was not a thing for people in that time period. And this book, if you read it, I have a copy of it. I bought it a few years ago, or
Yeah.
actually just a year or so ago, because I thought it looked interesting and it talked about Atlantis. I'm like, okay, I love this topic. Let me pick it up. Little did I know the whole backstory behind it. And it's a big part of Michael Flem's visions of Atlantis because there's some pretty compelling things that are described about Atlantis that reflect our modern world. So you have to ask yourself, like, was this kid peering into the future? Because he's writing about things like handheld devices that have mirror-like screens where your friends appear holographically and you can talk to them. And we all have that now with our phones, right? So
Exactly.
and this guy's living in the 1800s, and this spirit is telling him about Atlantis, right? And they're talking about flying vehicles. They're talking about whole world governments that are interacting with each other in that time period, which would be like 100,000 years ago. This guy Philos the Tibetan claimed to exist. So it's far out. People
Yeah.
might not necessarily like automatically take channeling as a reputable source, but when you actually sit down and read the material, you can see how it's kind of strange and otherworldly that this man, very young in the 1800s, would be able to describe such things that only seemingly are available now in this modern world, right? So he
Yeah.
was either predicting things or actually seeing the future, or seeing the past, right? Seeing this ancient world where their technology was more advanced. And you don't have to look to Graham Hancock and people like him to see that clearly the ancient world and what's left of it today implies there was a more advanced technology. The weight of these stones and the construction and how the Great Pyramids at Giza are completely aligned with the planet and different stars, and you
Yeah.
know eh, they're geographically at like the landmass center point, which it's like how would they even calculate that if they were just using slaves and ropes and pulleys and things like that to build it? It's silly to think in those terms. So that's
I,
why I think the Atlantis stuff is important, because there is countless cultural myths that seem to hint at this advanced civilization that fell to a cataclysm. And they
mhm.
have different words for this ancient culture around the world. And not all of them sound like the word Atlantis, but some of them resemble it, like this word Atlan, which is common, even the word Atlas, which makes people think that the Atlas Mountains were somehow connected to Atlantis. And I mean, hey, who knows? The Atlantic Ocean could have been smaller at one point, and North and America and Africa could have been closer. Where I currently live, the geography and the geology shows us that Morocco and New England at one point in time were connected because the
Oh,
same
wow.
types of rocks are
Yeah.
in both places. And I'm not a geologist, but there's an idea that, oh, this stuff happens over huge spans of time. And the Pangea, that was in the way distant past when there were dinosaurs, and that was way before humans ever existed. And I wonder if maybe we need to shrink that timeline a little bit,
Hmm.
or lengthen the amount of years that we consider human beings to be on the planet. And they're constantly pushing that date back further and further with new findings. So that's, I think, this idea that we're at our most advanced state of progress now as human beings is completely flawed. Everybody's kind of coming around to that idea in some way or another. Whether or not there were like these steampunk Starfort cities that the Tartaria YouTube channels seem to imply, I'm a little bit more, suspicious of that. What I
Yeah.
think is truer is that these sorts of very advanced cultures were, lost in the cataclysm that happened at least a couple thousand years ago, if not longer. And because of that long span of time, a lot of people forgot. And maybe that was calculated. Maybe the people in control made people forget about this time period. And then these religions were created to give people a different story or a different worldview because they understood how powerful it could be to manage somebody's reality in that way through a story. I mean, you see it now with this whole cancel culture BS where they want to give you this fake story of what it means to be a human, and everybody's androgynous and nobody has values, and it's all this
Yep.
kind of like over we mentality, but they think it's for the collective. It's very weird. And I don't know if it's going to correct itself or not. That's not really what I'm here to talk about. But, when we look in the ancient world with history, you see cycles, things repeating over and over again, like revolutions happen.
100%.
We have dictators, then new revolutions happen, and then new dictators, and so on and so forth. Maybe technology is the same way. Maybe we've had more advanced vehicles, more advanced forms of energy, more advanced forms of medicine that have been forgotten. And now we're using these kind of like digital carbon-based technologies. Maybe that's not the fullest extent. Maybe this has been calculated. Maybe these people have knowledge of what the actual, like, I don't know, maybe silicon-based technology, like quartz. I mean, computers are kind of silicon-based, but
Yeah.
maybe there are other bases of technology that have been left out because they know it's harder to manage people in those terms. And maybe the people who are controlling us, this cabal, maybe they think they're doing it for the right reasons. Maybe they remember what happened in the ancient past where these people got out of control with technology and they blew up a volcano and it caused the whole world to become like covered in ashes for, and killed millions of people and so on and so forth. Maybe they think they're preventing that by keeping our technology limited,
Suppressed.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah, these free energy technologies are too powerful if they get in the wrong hands. So I think that's all stuff that we need to consider. I'm not a fan of government. I think there's certainly, governments lying to us all over the world. There's not one government that's better than another.
I
They're all
agree. I
flawed.
agree. And yeah,
But
and I know, and I find that like divisiveness kind of happening so much, where it's like dividing. Oh, you're Republican or you're Democrat. Oh, we can't hang out. We can't be friends, and it's just a separation. And I find I was just, of course, wasting time trolling on the internet, but I don't support either. And someone was like, "Oh, Trump this," and I was like, "Yeah, sure." And I said, "Well, Biden this as well," and they can't accept that there's flaws on both sides. That's the issue, is that there's no accepting that my side is flawed, just as much as your side. It's my side's the best, and it's just crazy how people are just so up in arms, and I find it really crazy how people, they'd rather look. And I'm just as much to blame at this. People rather look outside instead of looking within, and to try to fix your own house, get your house in order. Um, but instead, they'll call out all their neighbors.
yeah, well, yeah, it's definitely the type of consciousness they want people in, makes
Hmm.
them easier to control, and that's a big reason why podcasts like this one are becoming more and more popular. People are waking up to that hidden messaging. They're waking up to the fact that our media is controlled, and they're looking for something more honest, something that's connected to reality. And that's, I think, also now becoming super popular, which gives us even more reason to be skeptical of what we see in these alternative realms too. So, again, I'm open-minded to the
Mhm.
ideas that these Tartaria channels are talking about, but the fact that a lot of them have hundreds of thousands of views, I'm not saying that that's necessarily an indication that, oh, they're bad people because they're popular, but YouTube typically censors people that are telling the truth, right? And
Fair
they don't
enough.
seem
Fair
to
enough.
censor that kind of stuff. I don't know
That,
why. They censor flat earth. They put like a big, disclaimer anytime you mention flat earth, but they don't put a disclaimer for Tartaria typically. I don't think I've seen that. Correct me if I'm wrong, folks, but I wonder if that's sort of an example of a modern day kind of psyop that's being put out there to kind of take attention away from the real old world stuff about Atlantis and America
Interesting.
and the hidden things that go into the foundations of these countries that are very new. I mean, even Mexico's a young country, Brazil, Argentina, all these countries in South America, Canada. I mean, they're all new countries. France is pretty new with their government, so we have these like new kind of things that have developed over the past 300-400 years. And I think there's more to be discovered as far as what happened before that time that's been maybe suppressed in these past couple 100 years.
I totally agree with you on that one. Like I believe that we're told that ropes and pulleys is how things were built, and no one had these knowledges, but the mathematics going into this, the engineering that went into it, because if we start looking at these huge pyramids, like what is the weight of those? So let's not talk about building the pyramid. Let's talk about building the substructure to support that pyramid so it doesn't actually start sinking on us. Like they built these skyscrapers. How long did they spend building the groundworks for it, and creating the foundation for it? Well, that often gets overlooked when you talk about pyramids. They just look at what they can see, but what's underneath? There's so much more than just pulling some blocks and oh, maybe they use buoyancy to traverse these blocks, to in channels to move these blocks. I'm like, you're grasping at something that's more of a conspiracy theory than to say that we had better technology back then. We had better ways of building this, and the pyramids are so much older than we're actually giving them credit for too, as well. It's we need to move it further back. We need to and be open to changing our history. Be open to like things not like, don't mind the fun, but things aren't set in stone. We have to be able to be fluid with this and say, okay. And as you're saying, like like the length that we as humans have been around, it keeps getting pushed back further and further and further, and I think it goes a lot further. And what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you feel that, like, how old do you think our civilization is? Do you think we were around when there was the dinosaurs? Do you feel, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's what the channelings seem to suggest. Edgar Casey is another person that
Mm.
channeled a lot of information about Atlantis, and some of his channelings talk about dinosaurs explicitly.
Yeah.
Um, Dinosaurs weren't so common knowledge in Casey's time, but they definitely were. They were known about. I think they were probably more recently unearthed and talked about. But yeah, there's one particular carving or hieroglyph of a what looks like a I don't know all my dinosaurs that well. Whichever dinosaur has the plates, the spiky plates on its back. Yeah,
Stegosaurus.
Stegosaurus. So there is a Stegosaurus that's depicted in a ruin, I think in Angkor Wat, somewhere around
Wow.
there. I think so. Yeah, it's not totally far fetched,
Hmm.
but when you hear about that, it definitely makes you wonder about where humanity comes from they give us this idea about humanity evolving from other forms of hominids and things like that. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily negate that. I just think the story is a little stranger, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you want to ask me for like a specific date, I'm definitely the wrong person to ask on that.
Yeah, I
There
understand that.
are
Yeah.
tons of podcast episodes I've done uh, with people who have talked about that. One example of an episode I put out recently, Douglas Preston spoke with myself and Roman, someone who he's kind of like a temporary part-time co-host every now and then. He has his own
Okay.
podcast, but we interviewed Douglas, and he talked about the Kennewick Man, which was found, and that definitely suggests humanity's a lot older than we've been taught. So yeah, I don't know the exact date, but folks can probably type in Kennewick Man and find out, you know, more
A little bit
information
more
there.
about that. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
Kennewick, Kennewick.
Ken O. Wick. I'm just going to put that in my notes right now.
Cool.
Interesting. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah, that would be my suggestion on that end, but definitely lots to find out when it comes to the old world. Like, there's tons of stone structures that don't get talked about. It's not just pyramids and super
Yeah.
massive megaliths. There's tons of, you know, categories when it comes to these stone structures.
I agree, and mounds as well. You know, like the mounds are a whole other bag of worms that we didn't even even scratch. You know, and giants. Yeah, we could talk about giants. You know, and you know, people say, well, I don't think giants could exist. I'm like, well, let's look back at the, you know, like we step back a little bit. We start looking at, you know, like there's a giant sloth, the giant armadillo, the giant, you know, we have the mammoth as well. Everything was giant because the oxygen levels were a little, you know, higher. So why couldn't hominid, we'll just say like a hominid like ourselves, of course I have other ideas about giants, but you know, why couldn't there be giant people as well? And it's too, I don't know. There's too many arguments to say that it exists. Like, it's too much evidence to say that it should exist, and just deniers saying, nah, nah. You know, mainstream media says it doesn't exist. I'm like, well,
We have
yeah.
massive animals on the planet, you
Hmm.
know. There's bears that are massive. There's, whales and elephants and giraffes and all sorts of creatures that are massive. So
Yep.
why couldn't humans be that big? There's also pygmy humans that are all over the world's rainforest. So we definitely can exists in that size, so why
Yeah.
couldn't we theoretically grow, right? I don't know. It's a whole nother realm than we've been taught, and I'm just excited to get to explore it in this way with other people who are also interested because, before I had a podcast, and I think before podcasts existed, a lot of us felt, very, isolated in these interests, you know?
I agree. I agree. It was, you know, I would say it was about 2010 when I first really, like, I always had interest in a lot of stuff, but it was around 2010 that I first acquired some, when I became quite interested into all this. And that was like, I watched a documentary by Benjamin Stewart called Kymatica, and that was kind of um, my eye opener a bit. You know, kind of like there's so much more, so many more questions, so many more, you know, connections, and from there it just grew and grew and grew. Like I said before, though, yeah, I was always into all the basic mysteries. You know, Bermuda Triangle, loved that one. You know, you got Bigfoot, Nessie, the basics. But my eyes were really started to be open, in, you know, in 2010, we'll say.
Right on.
Well, all right, Mark, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. My apologies to Tom. You missed it. Sorry, buddy.
No, it's my fault. I was 5 minutes late. Poor
not
form, but maybe next time. Sorry, Tom.
not a problem. Not a problem. No, yeah, like our times. I think we definitely got our times. Like we were we were probably like 2 hours in advance waiting. So it was like No worries. The time zones are always a killer. They always mess us up, but not an issue. Not an issue at all. So, Mark, why don't you tell our listeners and our viewers once again where they can find you?
Yeah, My Family Thinks I'm Crazy is the name of the podcast. Just type it in wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Instagram. I'm always posting there mainly. And then I put my stuff on YouTube and rockfin.com. I am on Rumble, but I think it's like it was automatically posted there. I don't know if they still take my RSS feed, but I have stuff on Rumble as well.
Oh, cool. And they do an RS feed on Rumble. That's interesting.
Yeah, they grab your RSS feed and then they turn those into audio,
Okay.
video. So it's not like a video, like I'm not uploading my YouTube videos there
Yeah.
the same way I have on YouTube. But yeah, there's something there on Rumble if people prefer Rumble.
So yeah, YouTube just started doing the RS feed as well. Where they I kind of messed up because we do our videos and then we kind of like separate our audio as well. But YouTube has started accepting RSS feeds now. So I submitted to it, and it just pretty much doubled up all our episodes. And so now we have like these double episodes where the one is just our thumbnail art, and it's just the audio. And now I got to go through and clean that all up. So that was a bit of a mess. So don't do that.
Well, yeah, if you don't already have a YouTube channel and you want to upload all your stuff, it's not a bad
Yeah,
option. But
then there's that option. Exactly, exactly. All right, Mark, I want to thank you very much. And if you just wait down below, and we'll just make sure all the recordings are 100%. I'm going to thank you, and I'm just going to do a quick outro.
right on.
All right, I want to thank Mark for coming on. That was fantastic, and unfortunately, Tom wasn't here for this one. He was here earlier. Again, just some issues with our most likely time zones. Time zones always mess up everything. So I want to thank you guys all for listening and tuning in. Make sure you guys like, subscribe, and if you yourselves have anything you want to share, you can always email me, the Lost Frequency Podcast at gmail.com, or Rye Voss on Facebook, or Tom Franklin on Facebook. We are on Instagram. We're on TikTok. We're on everything. And without further ado, without anything else left to do, I will say, here at the Lost Frequency, we bring the periphery into focus.
We close with good night, good luck, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Long live the cause of freedom.